Yes, welcome back to the Sports Show now, Barnesy. There is a lot of stuff, and they say a week's a long time in footy.
Yep.
A couple of games into the season could be fairly long. I want to ask you about Ross Lyon. Been a lot of talk about Ross Lyon. Freo have lost 20 of their last 24 games. They were belted by Geelong. They were absolutely smashed by Port Adelaide. He's contracted till 2020. They're saying that the rebuild word is now out, but against Port, they were the third oldest team to come out on the ground. So, he's starting to hear that one where we're supporting Ross Lyon. We've got him covered. We think he's great. Is he in danger?
He is. I think too much smoke and mirrors from Ross Lyon over the years. We've all had enough of it. I think the time has come and the game's moved past Ross Lyon and his style of coaching. I think Freo need to rebuild, starting with their coach. I really do, and I think that's on the card sooner rather than later. And I think with Rossi's smugness and the way that he is, I think he probably thinks it's further away than what it is. And I don't really think he'd care, given the fact that he's going to get paid through to 2020. So he seems to me the type of guy that, you want to get rid of me now? Okay, I'll take the money and run. And, sail off into the sunset. I don't think he'd mind too much, but I don't think his heart's in it. I think he's a blight on the game, to be honest. I think he should almost be banned from coaching.
Wow, okay, big statement, Barnesy.
No.
Mate, a couple of past senior players have come out and they said they think Fremantle are in the worst position that they've ever been in as a club. Do you think that's fair?
I think it's fair too, and I think that with Nat Fyfe, whether they keep him or whether they don't, you look at the Hawthorn model, and I don't see a lot of leadership around Nat Fyfe, and I don't know if he is the great leader that your Selwoods and your Hodges are. So there's a question mark there. I think the whole club at the moment is lacking leadership with a coach, and if not Fyfe, the senior group around Fyfe, obviously on field as well. I don't see anyone around him.
It's amazing how much pressure you can get under 2 games, or how much pressure you aren't under. Ken Hinkley on the reverse side. Most people thought 8 games in, maybe even 6, it could have been dead man walking.
Yep.
Suddenly they beat Sydney, they beat Freo. Showdown we'll talk about in a minute,
Yeah.
Showdown 42. He looks like he's ready to go for another year, and Koshy and him may fall back in love with each other.
That's correct, and they've obviously fallen out of love with each other, and also the Port supporters with Ken Hinkley. A couple of them had his head in a noose a few weeks back and wanted him gone by round 8 was the talk. So I think we've seen a lot of that with Choco as well when he was at Port Adelaide. He did a fantastic job for a long time, and they just outed him. And I think Ken Hinkley's a good coach, and I definitely think that if Port were to get rid of him, I think they'd be at a loss, because obviously he's getting the side together now. He's got Ryder back. Trengo's playing back. He's got a lot more structure with what he's got available. He's got his speedsters back with Polak and obviously Impey. I rate Ken Hinkley. I think they'd be silly to get rid of him. I'd get rid of Koshy before him.
You mentioned Mark Williams in that conversation.
Yeah.
Now, if we go back a couple of years, Dusty Martin with Richmond was a train wreck. They were thinking about letting him go. Lots happening in his life now. Mark Williams took on the role to look after Dusty and the mentor. Has a meal once a week with the family, but Mark also spent a lot of time with him working on his skills. We go forward 3 seasons, and he's now, or 2 seasons, now perhaps one of, if not the best player right now in the AFL. Do you reckon, firstly, has Mark been given enough credit for the work he's done with Dusty? Because we don't hear much about it.
No, I think that Choco's been an awesome coach and an awesome leader of men his whole career and his whole life. And I think he was one of the earlier coaches, or the senior coaches, that actually adapted to the way that different people are now. I think he's a perfect mentor for Dusty Martin, and it's obviously take the football side out of Dusty Martin, because he's always been good. He's always been touted as one of the best going around, and he certainly had a good start to the season. But now his off-field stuff, he seems to get it together. And as I said, I thought he wouldn't be a great fit for a lot of clubs to come in with the culture that he'd bring. I look at him now and go, mate, you'd be silly not to grab him.
All right, you're sitting up at the Gold Coast. It looks like Rodney Eade. I know we're talking about a lot of coaches that are under the pump, but Rodney's taken some big losses. They look like they're under the pump. If you were a smart recruiter, would you go, hang on a minute, we could get Mark Williams, premiership coach. Maybe if we get him, we could also get Dusty Martin. Gary Ablett's talking about leaving, wanted to leave this year, and is playing injured and not playing well. I'm sure it'll come again at the end of the season that he wants to leave. The question, of course, of the payout of his $1 million contract. But it wouldn't be foolish to just make a phone call and say, listen, Mark, we think you're a great coach. What are our chances if we get you that you could bring Dusty Martin to our program as well?
Yeah, I think they'd probably...
Would you make the call?
I think I'd probably 16 other clubs would make the call. Everyone except for the Bulldogs. I think they'd keep Luke Beveridge, but I think most people. I think that would be a consideration for Richmond as well. I think Dusty's in a position where he could actually say, "I will stay on at Richmond," and actually determine who coaches Richmond, or if Damien Hardwick's there. I think he's got that much power if he says, "I'll stay at Richmond, but I want to see a different coach in a different direction with our footy club going forward." And whether he says, "I want to bring Choco up with me," or whatever it is, I think he's got the ability to actually nominate a coach. Not that silly for Gold Coast, and I think they'd throw the checkbook at him. Dusty Martin without Choco running around on the Gold Coast, don't know about that. I mean, they've made a mistake with keeping Gary on as long as they have, it would be fair to say, in the last 2-3 years.
Yep.
They want to make sure they get it right, and Mark Evans is obviously going to start it at the top there and see how he goes.
All right, let's get on to it, mate. This week, Showdown 42. There's lots of other games, but that's the one we'll start with.
Yep.
Power, of course, up against Crows. First time in 42 showdowns that 1v2. A lot of talk about where the game may or may not be won.
Yep.
Big focus on Sam Jacobs, who probably had one of his best games last week for the Crows. Paddy Ryder, who's been in sensational form in his first 2 games after a year off. Who's going to get the chocolates in that one? Sam or Paddy Ryder? Who would you go with?
I don't know, mate.
Tough one, too tough to call, break even?
Yeah, Ryder looks good, doesn't he? Jacobs marked above his head very well last week. You'd like to think that Jacobs could go with him for the bulk of it.
All right, midfield. They're pretty special midfields, both of them.
Yeah, and the word that on everyone's mind at the moment is Powell Pepper. So
Has he surprised you?
He's surprised everyone. I don't think anyone could remember 2 better games from someone on debut.
Maybe Ollie Wines?
I reckon he's better than Ollie Wines, mate. Yep. I reckon he's got a bit of Mark Rasciuto about him. I mean, I reckon he has.
Now we're talking about the greatest.
Yeah, well, you hear stories of Roo playing senior footy for Waikerie when he was 14.
Yep.
This kid looks like he could have been doing that when he was 10. So the mark that he's got, and he's got that arrogance about him. Ollie Wines seems to be a little bit reserved. I don't think I'd see Ollie Wines running around slapping blokes on the bum after 2 games. But Powell Pepper, as I said, he could win the showdown medal and win the game for Port Adelaide off his own boot, the way that he's looking.
Have you got a feel for which way the game may go? Now, I know you're a Crows man, but can you take your Crows hat off just for a minute and give us an unbiased opinion?
All right, I reckon the Crows will win by 80-plus points. I reckon
80-plus points?
I reckon Eddie will kick 8, Tex will kick 7, and I think the headline on the Sunday Mail will be Cracked Pepper, mate.
Pepper.
I think we'll run through and Rory Sloane will teach him a lesson and we'll have a good win. I am not as reserved as other people in my footy tips, mate. I will actually...
You like to come outside the circle. You've come out a fair way. 80 points.
80 points.
Will it be a sellout? 50,000 plus?
Oh, it has to. It is the biggest build-up of any showdown that I've ever seen. And I think, obviously, I was a bit tongue-in-cheek with my tips there, but no one seems to have that argument this week. There's no argument. There's no, we played Sydney in Sydney, or we beat Freo, or we beat Hawthorn. There's no arguments because we're both undefeated. Come the final siren on Saturday night, that's bragging rights. So for a showdown, in the past it might mean that a team slips out of the 4 or gets into the 8. There's not as much on the line. This is on the line. You're going to be 3-0 after 3 rounds of footy for the winner of this game, and both clubs probably would take that every day of the week for the last 20 years that they've been in the competition. So no bigger reward than being 3-0 after this showdown. So for both clubs, it's got a million stories in it. Like you say, Ryder and Jacobs, Eddie Betts, Powell Pepper, Chad Wingard, Ebert. Where do you want to start?
It's got it all, isn't it?
It's just like, it's a modern day epic. Like, I can't think of a better game that I can remember going to a showdown and a build up than what's happening. And the weather being a cracker too, 30-odd degrees.
Yep.
The beers go down a lot better at 30-odd degrees. Cannot wait. And I'll take a point. I'll take a win by a point, mate.
For the Crows?
I'll take it.
All right, I want to ask you this. There was a good article that Kane Corns wrote this week in the paper. It's always tough to write about your family. He wrote about his brother, saying that he thought that Chad Corns was the man that galvanised teams and the fans to go against Crows or Power. Was there anyone else? I mean, he certainly wasn't he? He was loved
absolutely
by the Power, hated by the Crows fans.
Yep.
Can you think of anyone else that's galvanised them as much as he has?
Warren Treadray was pretty hated, I think.
Yep.
He was in that mould. So definitely Chad led the garden. Warren was there as well. When we look back at the, I think it was the 2007 preliminary final where Treadray was doing a jig or Corns was doing a bow or vice versa. And
Treaders did the bow.
Yeah, whatever it was. And then they went out the next week and got licked by 119 points. So you love to hate those players. Chad Corns was, I thought he was hard done by at the end of his career. obviously by Port Adelaide, he was one of the greats, mate. He honestly, his hands, obviously Tredrea was one of the greats too. I think Tredrea would be spoken about better if he could kick straight early in his career.
Do we love a bit of Eddie Betts though? You know, the smile, the fingers, the whole thing about Eddie in the pocket.
I mean, I think the things for South Australians and looking back, and we spoke about older games before we come on the set today, is you look back at the Modras and there's Modra here in terms of hype. Like, he used to own the town.
Yes,
like,
no
you know, he wouldn't have paid for a beer, and no wonder he's put on a few kilos because he hasn't paid for a beer in the last 20 years, and nor should he. But Eddie Betts is closing that gap. He is just an aura, and it's every week he does it. And that was what Modra used to do. Every week he'd take a hanger, he'd kick goals from the boundary. Eddie Betts on the weekend, we've seen him get the handball and kick it from the boundary, but nothing better than that Eddie chant going around. And I don't know how big it will be on Saturday night because it's a Port home game, but yeah, love Eddie Betts.
All right, so you've got the Crows just running away with it, 7-10 at Adelaide Oval. Let's get to the other games that are on this weekend, mate. Friday night, Sydney. They sit in 15th spot. Collingwood in 11th at the SCG. Now, Sydney have won the last two matchups at the SCG, and it's a tough ground to play on. Collingwood at the moment are the most inaccurate team in front of goal. Sydney or Collingwood?
Sydney, of course.
All right. Saturday, North Melbourne play GWS. 12th up against 9th. North Melbourne have won 4 of the last 5 matchups with GWS.
Yeah, I'll tip North Melbourne.
North Melbourne. Richmond v West Coast. 3v5 at the MCG. Two different styles here, really, aren't they? West Coast are pretty upbeat, up-tempo style of game. Richmond, I think they're ranked down. Their last 5 games have been 3 to West Coast, 2 to Richmond. So this might be a good test.
I hope so. And West Coast were lucky to get away with a win last week at home against St Kilda. I think West Coast will win, but wouldn't be surprised if Richmond were competitive.
All right, Geelong in 7th, Melbourne in 4th. Now, last year they met round 23. Geelong beat Melbourne by 111 points. So can pre-season make that much difference?
No, and Jesse Hogan's out, and so is Jordan Lewis, which is undisciplined. So, look, I think the Cats might only get them by 110 points this week.
And here's one you'd really struggle with, mate. Freo in 18th spot, the Doggies in 8th. I guess the only question is the margin.
It is. And hopefully the Bulldogs just wrap themselves in cotton wool and don't get injured.
All right. Sunday, St Kilda 13th, Lions are in 10th. It's at Etihad. Brisbane are a different team this year, but so...
When you talk about rebuild, they look like they're on the way
Fagan's done a good
up.
job with them.
He has. And from all reports, he's a ripper. So obviously the Saints should win that.
Saints.
Richo looks like he's doing a good job.
Carlton v Essendon, 16 versus 6. You'd think Essendon comfortably, wouldn't you?
You'd hope so.
You'd hope so. Hawks are in 14th spot. Unusual to say that number for them, isn't it? Against the Suns, they're at Metricon. The Hawks have won the last 5 times. I wouldn't think this would be any different, would you? No? All right, so in summing it all up, the game that really matters, you've got the Crows by 80 points over the Power.
Sneaking it in.
Barnesy, I hope you're here next week so we can talk about that. Hope you've enjoyed the show, everybody. Look forward to your company next week. Bye, everybody.